Kia ora, everyone. Thanks for having me along. I always have had an aversion to being invited along as an expert. I remember the first time I ever got, I had someone from the government ring me up and said, "Grant, would you like to be on an expert ICT panel?" And I immediately politely declined because I actually didn't know what ICT stood for. So I have this history of kind of blundering into things because I'm just a mechanical engineer, and you'll see there's a bit of a theme of that as we go through here today as well. So the other thing I've kind of always been intrigued in is the different levels at which people pick up technology. So 20 years ago when I was a young and enthusiastic kind of person, I had a business card, and I didn't like people ringing me up, so I just had an email, and I gave it to an older business person. He's like, "I'm not on email." And I was like, "How can you not be on email? Get with it, get into it." I just couldn't believe that some people couldn't do that. And then last year, a young enthusiastic person gave me a business card. He didn't like email or phones. He had WhatsApp and Twitter, and I'm like, "Oh geez, I'm the old bugger now." So with that, the first thing I'm going to talk about is, does anyone know what this machine is? No, so this is an unusual story. I'll talk about the Cacophony project a bit later on, but 10 days before lockdown, I got a call from Sam Morgan, who I've known since before he was rich and famous, and he's like, the news was all about in Italy, people were dying, they're out of ventilators, New Zealand needs ventilators, we can't get ventilators. And he said there's an interesting bloke in Christchurch has designed this machine. This is actually an anaesthetic machine. And as Sam's talking about this, I'm like, look, I couldn't even spell anaesthetic or ventilator. So what are you talking to me about this? But so he'd got this certified to work in developed worlds, so it's got a ventilator built into it. And New Zealand wasn't able to buy ventilators, and the whole thing was, we need ventilators. And so he's like, can you go along and check this out and see if we can make them? We want to make 1,000 a month. I was like, well, that sounds pretty unlikely. So anyway, dove into that, went and had a look at it, and we got a mechanical engineer, and we got set up to try and make a bunch of these machines in Christchurch so that we could meet this need for ventilators, because that was kind of what the whole thing was. It was quite an interesting project. And then through doing this, there were a whole lot of other innovative ventilator type projects happening around New Zealand, and Sam Morgan and Stephen Tyndall actually funded 4 of them as kind of an insurance policy for New Zealand that they've never talked about, but if you ever see them, say thank you. We didn't need it, but it was kind of cool. But this was really kind of unusual in that I ended up being this coordinator for all these ventilator projects, and it very quickly moved from words I couldn't spell to words I couldn't pronounce. And when someone from the Ministry of Health rang me up to talk about ventilators after 2 weeks, I was like, I need to offload this. So I actively offloaded it and got someone else to do it. But it was just an interesting little project of how the tech community in Christchurch got together to make these things. So they ended up making 50 really quickly, and we didn't end up needing to make 1,000 a month. And then a couple of days after that, I got another call, and someone said, New Zealand we need to have a way that we can measure people's temperatures as a way to kind of work out what's happening for, whether they've got a fever. And because they contacted us because we use thermal cameras for predator detection, which I'll tell you about a little bit further on. And I immediately said, well, there's no point us doing that because lots of people do that. But there was like a 3-month lead time to get these things. We needed them now. Can you convert some of your cameras so that we can read temperatures and help with this? And the reason temperature is really important is it's one of the first symptoms of COVID, and it's a really inexpensive way of doing it. And so these thermal cameras are actually pretty good at it. It's not the most accurate way to take temperature. A thermometer is, but you obviously can't do that. And there's even more accurate ways, but they're less acceptable again. So there's a kind of a compromise between us. So we're part of this group looking at a whole list of things that we could do to try and help this COVID thing. So it's a really good indicator because it's one of the first ones. Most people get it. And what we're trying to do is really try and find the quickest way that you can find the people that have got COVID. So there's a whole lot of things kind of add up together. And one of the biggest delays, there's a lot of people talk about the contact tracing being really important, and it is. But actually, if someone's out there and they don't bother to go and get a test, so the sooner you can identify them to get a test, and also when they've got a fever, they're typically a lot more, they're shedding a lot more virus as well. So it's kind of part of a whole range of things. So the thing when you develop a fever, so you kind of start to get a fever, but you typically have it for a while before you bother to go in and get a test. And what we're trying to do is get people to have a test as soon as possible. So, the sooner you can do that, the better, really. And the value of having a thermal monitoring thing is that you can potentially detect people who've got a change in temperature before they even know it themselves, because quite often you don't even know yourself. So it can't detect if you've got COVID, but imagine you've got the 10,000 most people at risk. If you can constantly take their temperature, and then you can see if there's a slight difference, they're the ones that should be having a COVID test. So it's kind of part of that suite of things. One of the problems that we kind of, when we were reading the literature around this, was that everyone's got a slightly different natural temperature and it changes during the day. And so you can have some people that are naturally hot that'll set off things constantly. And you have some people that are naturally cold that can have the start of a fever but be below a temperature. So you've got this false positive, false negative things. So as soon as we kind of learned about that, we kind of tried to work out, well, what's the standard where you can, have people measure their own temperature. So you scan a card and then you can actually see, well, you're not comparing your temperature to a normal distribution, you're comparing it to what you normally are. And apparently they don't really do that. So this was just a way that we could actually much more systematically find out, what's happening with an individual. So what we did is we took our predator cam that we use for looking at possums, and rats and stoats, and we put a little tablet on it. The people at University of Canterbury did a really great piece of work to give us a constant temperature source. So we, within a couple of weeks, had a first working prototype that we were starting to test, and now it's turned into a product that's actually pretty stable, works really quite well. The bit that was really interesting was thinking about how do you do something a bit more innovative than just measure a temperature. So what you've got is, imagine this thermal camera, it's got 10,000 little temperature readers. And the way that they typically work is you just try and find one number and say you're hot or not hot. And then you just compare it to a normal population. But we're saying, well, you can compare it to your personal temperature. But also one of the interesting things is that when you start to get a fever, some of your internal organs can be the bits that heat up first, and your face can actually potentially get cooler. So what we're saying is, can you, rather than just come up with a number, you think of how much information you lose converting all that to one number, can you just look for a pattern change and say, of these people at the highest risk, whose patterns change more than most? They're the people that should go and get a test. And so for a few cents, standing in front of this thing really quickly, you've got a way that you've got kind of part of the suite of products to do it. So we were also working with a group that was playing around with a COVID card. If anyone's interested in that, I can explain a little bit about some of the background behind that as well. But if you have this we were thinking of it as a digital shield. So you've got a way of saying there's something developing in someone with a thermal camera, and then you've got a COVID card so you can see exactly who they're there. So you've got a couple of digital tools that you can really have a crack at being part of a generic thing for not just COVID, but any new infectious disease potentially. And if you think about what New Zealand was trying to do, we were trying to go hard, go fast. And we were doing the lockdown, the border control, and partly because we did these other things so well, we haven't really needed to do these other things. But they're kind of sitting there as something that we can apply as soon as we need to. So I think one of the things that I certainly feel more appreciative of now is the quality of living in a country with a high quality civil service. We saw that with the talk about IRD this morning. It's really quite innovative compared to a lot of other places. And our high quality civil service and health that's kind of got New Zealand in such a great place to be. I think we're pretty lucky to be here, to be honest. So the Cacophony project. Has anyone heard me talk about the Cacophony project? Oh geez, I'll try to come up with different jokes. Maybe not. So I got into this accidentally after the earthquakes. I moved to Akaroa. I don't expect sympathy, it's actually quite nice. But our house was infested with rats, stoats and possums, and then I started to learn about the New Zealand situation. And I think the thing that shocked me was New Zealand's not worst in the world at hardly anything. But in terms of the proportion of our natural environment, fauna that is endangered, we're worse than pretty much any country in the world. So you go to places where they're chopping down forests and hunting things, we're still worse. 70% of our birds are either already endangered or still in decline. If it was more visual, we'd be horrified. And so I was like, well, that's a big meaty problem. That's pretty interesting. And so I sort of started trapping just like any other Kiwi, lots of Kiwis do. But then the engineer in me is going, man, this is pretty primitive the way we do it. I just wanted to know with my trapping whether we're getting more birds or not. So we've got a purposely taking a high-tech approach because a lot of the tools are literally medieval. They're kind of food whackers and primitive monitoring tools. So we thought if we digitize it, then we can kind of really make a difference. It's all open source. It's a non-profit open source thing. I've gone from patenting software to being an open source hippie. It's kind of cool when people just start writing code for you. It's really cool. And then there's been a lot of focus on the science stuff, but there's been very little focus on the engineering solutions. And as this room knows, there's quite a difference between science and engineering. I can talk about that as well, because it's quite interesting. So the first thing I wanted to know is, if we're doing this trapping, are we getting more birds coming up? So we developed a little app that sits on a phone, wakes up a couple of times a day, puts the data to the cloud, and then over time you can kind of see, you know, instead of doing a 5-minute bird count, are you actually getting more birds out there? And so obviously this device that measures the bird song, it's kind of a cacophony of bird song, so clearly we call it a cacophonometer. And when we weaponize it, it'll be a cacophonator. Now, the other talks today have given you little pearls of wisdom, and I didn't really have any, but I have one now, and I'll give it to you, and that is, don't let engineers come up with product names. So with this cacophony index, potentially you can then dig in and look at exactly what sort of birds you've got there, because we were just really about measuring the bird song, saying ultimately this stuff will get cleverer and cleverer and you'll be able to reanalyze it and know exactly what's going on. The bit that we then got interested in was, how do you remove the predators more effectively? And so the current ways that they monitor predators are really quite primitive. They put out a little chew card and hope that an animal chews it, or a little tracking tunnel, and they hope that an animal goes in, and then you go and look at the ink pad and the feet on it. And you know, we started using some trail cameras, and the trail cameras are designed for pigs and deer, and they work really well for that, but not very well for these things. So we tried to see if we could buy a thermal camera that would do this, but we ended up just kind of creating one. And then the real advantage of this is that you can see exactly what's going on. And you can, obviously you can see the artificial intelligence is actually telling you what's there. So instead of, you've got a much better idea of, you know, working out what's going on. This is an interesting little experiment. There's actually two trail cameras there, one right up close to a trap, and then one a bit further back. Can you see the rat there? So this is kind of what you get from those. This was over just a couple of days, what you'd get on a trail camera. And then this is kind of showing what is actually happening out there with the rats. And it's quite funny, we'll go and put these somewhere and someone will say, oh, don't put it here, there won't be anything here, and almost inevitably there is. So this is an example. In this particular case, we've got a standard dock tracking tunnel there, and this is an example of 0 rats. So you don't have much chance of controlling things if you can't really see what's going on. One of the things we're particularly interested in is digital lures. So instead of hoping that they'll come along and sniff a piece of food, we can put out a bit of sound and it can lure them in. And it's looking like social sounds are working really well, so you can cover a much larger area and get them in. You can make it species specific, you can make it adaptable and learning. It can, you know, last a lot longer. and it's even more efficient when you get the last hard to get one or a reinvasion. So in that case, you've actually got lots of food everywhere, and what they're after next is a little bit of social interaction. And one of the reasons I quite like this project is people go, "Oh, Grant, what are you working on?" And I say, I spend quite a lot of time thinking about possum erotica, and and it can stop a conversation quite quickly, actually. And one of the other intriguing things about this is if you can attract half the population, potentially you can actually get rid of the whole population. So there's some really interesting things you can do about that and get it really adaptable. And potentially you can have this adaptive learning system that can evolve faster than the predators. This is this is 6 different traps with freshly baited different baits in them. And so basically when we started doing this, what we discovered was just how ineffective these traps are. So what will happen typically is if an area has never been trapped, you will go out and you can pretty much any trap and you'll catch quite a lot of things. But then over time, the population that's left pretty much avoids them. And so what our camera was able to show in a way that's never been seen before is just how ineffective these traps are. This whole video that I'll just loop through goes for about 3 days. It took about a month before these traps caught anything. This wasn't our traps. This was very experienced trappers up in Auckland. And the thing I've found interesting, I mean, if I hadn't done other innovative things, it would be depressing, but is just how you can show this to the people and they just don't believe it. They say, "Oh, you've set it up wrong, you've done this wrong," but we've seen it over and over again in different places, so we kind of know it's not just our traps. The way you set up traps, we're trying lots of different things. And the reason that that's so important is that unless you really acknowledge that, how you go about solving it really changes. So because we're getting such pushback that actually traps are better than that, you must be doing it wrong, we actually did a little model with completely independent data. And what we did is we looked at the 60 best monitored projects around New Zealand, and we looked at the trap density and the number of predators, and we looked at how often they catch things, and then we looked at how could those numbers match up, how often were they interacting with the traps. And the only way you could make those numbers match up was pretty much they were living around the traps, not interacting with them. So completely independent set of data kind of showed that they really weren't working very well at all, which is pretty interesting, actually. But again, we're still, it's kind of hard because we're kind of telling people what doesn't work, so we really wanted to have something that did work. Does anyone want to have a guess at, of all these projects out there, how many catches per trap they get per year on average? This is on the best monitored projects. Just have a number in your head because everyone's too embarrassed to say a number. Does anyone want to shout one out? No. Sorry? 200. 200? 3.6. That's closer. But it's 1.8. So this is the kind of distribution of them. So basically what you have is the reason they make these traps so need to make them inexpensive and they need to make them robust that can last for a long time, because the embedded assumption is they don't work and you have to leave them there forever. And then I'm going to show you something that'll look really expensive and you go, well, that could never work, that's too expensive. But what we're completely flipping around how you think about this. So instead of having a whole lot of devices that are really quite ineffective, what we're trying to say is if you've got something that's really effective and you can identify, lure and kill everything, then you don't need to leave it there. And you can move a line of these through an area, get rid of the whole lot, and then you don't have to keep trapping forever. And that's kind of what we're planning to do. So if this just simple model, don't worry about the details, it's not worth having a look, but if you can just increase that catch rate from interaction rate, so getting them to interact instead of 0.5% of the time to 10% of the time, you can dramatically drop the population. And so, so that's what we're kind of busy trying to do. So this is our first kind of crack at a much more open live capture trap. So from a predator's point of view, this is about 1 metre by 1 metre. This looks like if you've got if you've got feral soft toys, it works on that too. And just whatever you got. Right? So this kind of, oh, I know, I let it go. So these are videos that show with the trail cameras working. So of all the times we've had it out there, the trail cameras are actually really hard. So what happens is we guide them into this trap, and then they go into the back trap. So the first part of it, we're trying to see if the predators are happy to go into this type of trap. So this is a thermal camera. It's a bit harder to see. You can see there's a rectangle there. The possum's about to go into it. One of the reasons the advantage of these thermal cameras is that we have them on the whole time, and then there's a software way to detect when they're coming in. So we can actually see animal behaviour much better than you've been able to see. So it allows us to develop things that you kind of haven't had the data to develop before. So what we can really quickly see is that these animals are very happy to just wander into these, as opposed to the other traps that they just don't like sticking their head into. One of the funny, it is quite funny things is, you saw those little, we call them hazing, that hang out the side of the trap. Basically, if we didn't put that on, there's still a whole lot would just walk straight past it. So we've found a very high-tech way of finding that a bit of hessian really helps trap catching. And then this trap activates really very quickly. That particular bit's a bit hard to see, actually. But you can see here, it acts very quickly. It can catch all predator types, so potentially the way that we're looking at setting these up, one of the new things we're looking at doing is you have to be able to protect an area if you want to be able to keep it predator-free and not have to keep doing it. So you can actually have it what we call an active fence. So you have a long line of kind of pretty low-tech hessian. This is just showing that what happens is they get caught in the blinds, and then immediately they go into a back trap. And this next little bit shows the whole thing of a cat going in, running around a little bit, flying out the back. And I know that's going to make some of you uncomfortable looking at this is a feral cat caught out near, there's some endangered birds, banded dotterels, that are getting caught by feral cats. And yeah. The current way they use to catch them is leak hold traps, which is beyond, I don't think that's a great way to do it, but that's the state of the art at the moment. So we're just trying to find a more humane way of doing it. And if you look at what we're doing, we find the open source thing interesting. Like, Kiwis kind of partly understand it, but even for conservation people, the idea that we kill innocent animals is a bad thing. And I still struggle with it. But basically the point is to, if we get rid of them totally, then we don't have to keep doing it, which is what we're all signed up for at the moment. And people are like, well, you can't hurt innocent animals. Everyone's got a right to thrive and what have you. But, people get excited about protecting a cathedral that's 150 years old that we could build any time we like. But we've got species that have evolved over 30 million years that are dying on our watch. And we go, do we want more rats, or do we want to just let it go? I don't know. For me, it feels like it would be, not a cool thing. Now, if you look closely at this video, you'll see the quality of videography if you get an engineer to do something. It's not very good. I told him to get rid of his jandals, but he wouldn't. So one of the other things that you could probably see from looking at those earlier videos is that potentially you could track. It's interesting watching the AI try and guess what the radio control car with a hottie on it is. We haven't trained it for feral radio control cars. But one of the things that we can potentially do that will be more portable than the trap that we've developed, that I always thought was a short-term thing to get us the next step, is we can have a device that can track and then potentially fire a paintball with poison on them at an animal. So you can do it in a much more targeted way, potentially. You can fire me lots of questions about that sort of stuff if you like, because we have started playing with paintball guns. And the mechanical engineer in me certainly gets excited about that sort of thing. But, I mean, if you look at it, all of this stuff is considered very out there by the powers that be. But when you've got a tech mindset, you go, well, actually, no, it's just some standard engineering. And that's the beauty of the open source thing as well. So this is actually my favorite video of all the videos that I'm going to show you today. And all it is showing the evolution of our project on GitHub. Because it's all open source, and I asked the guy who's in charge, is there a way that we can kind of show how it's evolved? So what this shows is the people involved and the little bits of software and how it's evolving. And what I think is cool about this is, within 10 minutes of me asking, he just downloaded something free off GitHub that produced this for us. But what you can see is it's kind of like this is this evolutionary creature that is the tech community, mostly in New Zealand, that's trying to take on the rats, stoats and possums on behalf of our native flora and fauna. And I just think it's kind of cool. So the way that we work is we're a non-profit charitable trust. We've taken the best of the open source methods. I founded this with Dave Lane, who a lot of you may know, who chairs New Zealand Open Source. And I really asked him, what's the best method that we can set this up? And as a lot of you will know how well open source works, things like Wikipedia, put Encarta and Encyclopedia Britannica out of business. And a lot of the core software, it sounds hippie, but things like Red Hat can be really successful businesses using open source, and Catalyst is here and a bunch of others. And so we wanted to take this best practice thing and then put it to work at this for this. And so that we've had 2 companies founded to try and set up and make and sell services. I've conned my brother into starting a company, thanks bro, to make and sell these products. So I can do the fun part and he can do the bit that he's way more useful than I am. And then there's another company starting to sell services to these large projects so that we can get it out there. And hopefully there'll be lots of companies that can make and sell and create these products and services. And this is just a list of a bunch of our supporters who are all excellent supporters, and there's a few others there as well. And when you're working with exponential technology, a lot of you are probably familiar with this. I kind of don't have to explain it in great detail, but when we fill out these forms with Department of Conservation and others, and they're like, well, how many predators have you killed in the last year, and how many are you going to kill next year? And we're like, well, probably very few. But we're working on this process where you can see that the trajectory of what we're doing, if it's digital, it's not constrained. A mousetrap is not going to get twice as good or half the price every 18 months or 2.5 years. And so while we're kind of in the disappointment phase at the moment because we're not catching much, you can probably see that you can have this really sophisticated data-driven process that's got a chance of really taking them on. And so I can visualize a scenario where you've got a device that's sitting out there listening for what's out there. It pings sounds, listens for things, then depending on that, it plays different sounds, lures them in, identifies them and eliminates them, and then you've got a line of these things that sweeps through an area, gets rid of the whole lot, and you don't have to do it again. And then we will get our Cacophony back. And so Sean's busy hiring some people, if you know any good software developers. Yeah, if you've got any questions, let me know. Cheers.
And we do have a couple of questions. Alex was wondering, does that big triangle trap need to be cleared after every activation?
At the moment it does, but we've also designed methods of that have got auto-killing devices in them. So we've had it so that it's had a pile of 4 dead bodies as our record so far. And I know you can chuckle, and it's not really very funny when you, but it's much more effective than the current ways of doing it. But actually, that is specifically designed for the last hard-to-get predators. So in that case, you can have someone clearing a device each day. So there's lots of ways that you can work up to more sophisticated ways of doing it.
Cool. Alex was wondering, sorry, no, that was Alex's question. Josh was wondering, what minimum hardware is required to be able to contribute to the project?
Just a computer. It's all online, so it's all set up in GitHub, so you can see there's a whole lot of projects tagged. But just give us a ring. If you've got any skills, let us know. there's a whole lot of things that are on the critical path that we've got key people busy working on. There's a whole lot of things that are nice to haves that typically people have a crack at to start off with. So we try and, we've had contributors from the Ukraine, from all over the place, but we kind of like Kiwis because they, I mean, a lot of them are not Kiwis, but they live here, but they understand the problem in a way that is easier to communicate. So, yeah. The Ukraine guy could have been from Russia. We don't know, you know.
Kylie's one asked, are the trap prototypes available for purchase?
Shortly, but the initial ones are quite expensive because they're prototypes, but we'll slowly get them more and more. So early in the new year, look out for them. And our favourite people to work with are people who understand trapping, who are tech savvy and are happy to kind of work with that early stage thing, because there's lots of ways that people can contribute. So lots of conservation people aren't tech savvy, and it's a bit harder for them to understand a product development cycle that all of you guys, everyone here will probably understand. So.
I like this question from Irina at Jade. Do you think through the Black Mirror scenarios when you work on your designs and experiments?
Yes, absolutely. And we get this asked a lot, oh, you know, this could lead to, you know, what if someone gets hold of your device that can point and shoot? And I'm like, you know what you can buy at Bunnings and clip together? And it's not open source and you can't see that you've downloaded the code. There's so many simpler ways of doing things. And none of this is anything that the military wasn't doing 15 years ago. I mean, this is not, it's not bleeding. Like for the conservation industry, this is bleeding edge, but for the tech industry, you're probably all looking at it going, well, it's not very hard AI. None of it's actually particularly hard. It's just clipping together existing tools. And, you know, the dystopian AI thing, it's a fascinating thing. It's funny, we have people I think some people are just inherently pessimistic. A couple of times now I've had it where people have said, oh, you'll never be able to outsmart rats, they're too clever and what have you. And then you're talking about AI and then they're like really worried computers are going to take over the world. And then you're like, well, hang on, you can't believe both of those things, can you? So...
There are people that will. Now, Chris has asked, are you looking at any flora predators? Any predators that are affecting the flora rather than the birds?
Well, it's really those main mammal predators that are... We're not looking at getting rid of non-native birds, for example, or anything like that at this stage. Who knows? I mean, it is a generic technology. Sean's just done a bit of work for the Otago Regional Council to identify wallabies because they're starting to cross the bridges down over the Waitaki. So the current method is they wait for a farmer to see one and then they go and send a team of hunters in. So Sean's just set up a camera on the dam so it can basically AI identify a wallaby and then send them a text message, and eventually we can hook it up to a vicious sounding dog in the middle of the dam and then have them turn around and head back. And so it's a flexible set of ways of identifying, luring, eliminating these things that, you know, they're all... I've got a lot more empathy for these creatures, having watched tens of thousands of these videos. It's not their fault, but they don't belong here, and our native fauna hasn't evolved to cope with them, which is why we're in so much trouble.
Bill was wondering, how accurate are your bird numbers? He was saying they do the same thing, analysing the noise of bats, and their margin is about 30%. Are you looking at actual numbers? We are looking to ensure the population stays static or increases, he was saying.
So at the moment, that's really very crude. We've just focused on collecting the data so that we've got a baseline there, because at the moment, most projects have no way of reanalyzing anything. And we kind of view that any way that we can analyse it now is almost irrelevant, because it'll be so much better in 5 years and 10 years. We're just starting to collect the data. But most projects do absolutely no analysis of whether their bird numbers are going up or down, which, you know, as engineers, we just kind of go, what? It seems weird.
Yep, let's prove the concept. Sean, interesting one. Did you engage with any animal ethics organisations when developing the products?
Yes, and we constantly do that. And I've talked at an animal ethics conference specifically to try and workshop what it is we're trying to do, because it is it is an issue around the animal ethics, but most people, I think, would be horrified by what we currently do. We still actively use leg hold traps, and some of the poisons that we use, actually not the 1080, but the Barificum, are banned overseas because of how inhumane they are. But at the moment, if we didn't have some of those things, then we'd be in an even worse position. But what we're trying to do here is say, let's give a bigger, broader tool set that's got the ability to do areas and protect them in a way that you don't have to keep doing it. So we think long-term, ethically, it means you don't have to keep killing things. And that's what we're aiming for.
And best way for people to get involved is just head to the website?
Yeah, head to the website. We'll force you to sign up and have a yarn to us.
Marvellous. Ladies and gentlemen, Grant Ryan.